The Eastern Mediterranean at 2:58 p.m. held 12 nautical miles of open water between the carrier and what was coming from the northeast. 12 nautical miles was the specific distance that mattered on this particular afternoon, because 12 nautical miles was the distance the destroyer had been assigned to hold between the carrier and any adversary contact that presented an unresolved tactical question. The destroyer was the escort. The carrier was the reason. 12 nautical miles was the geometry that the escort existed to maintain. At 12 nautical miles, the destroyer could identify, assess, and respond to a contact before it became the carrier's problem. Below 12 nautical miles, both problems arrived simultaneously. The carrier was 40 nautical miles to the southwest, conducting flight operations in a routine cycle. Its battle group was distributed across a 30-mile radius in standard formation. The Eastern Mediterranean, at 2:58 p.m., was busy in the way contested sea lanes were always busy. Commercial traffic on the southern routes, a French frigate on the northern horizon operating under NATO maritime coordination, and the distant radar returns of Syrian coast traffic that had been present since before the watch began. At 2:58 p.m., the Udaloy changed course. It had been tracked since 11:15 a.m., a Udaloy-class destroyer that had departed the Russian naval facility at Tartus, 80 nautical miles to the northeast, on a heading consistent with a Mediterranean transit. At 11:30 a.m., it had been assessed as routine patrol. At 2:58 p.m., it was no longer routine anything. Bridge CIC. Contact Delta 1 has altered course. New heading 022, speed 18 knots. Course change places Delta 1 on a direct intercept with our position. CPA estimate 300 yards. Time to CPA 24 minutes. 022 was not a transit course. The transit course from Tartus heading 022 would carry a vessel toward the Turkish coast or the Aegean. 022 from the Udaloy's current position was an intercept course. The specific vessel it was intercepting was the one that sat between it and a U.S. aircraft carrier 40 nautical miles to the southwest. At 3 p.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He studied the contact picture for 20 seconds, Delta 1's track, the CPA projection, the carrier's position. He noted the geometry. He turned to the officer of the deck. "I have the con. CPA to Delta 1, 280 yards. Time to CPA 22 minutes. The $7.2 billion carrier was conducting flight operations with approximately 5,000 crew aboard. The carrier was the strategic fact that made U.S. presence in the Eastern Mediterranean mean something specific to every party that had an interest in what happened in Syria, in the Levant, in the contested airspace over the Eastern Basin. The Udaloy was approaching the asset that sat between it and that carrier. The destroyer was $2.1 billion and 287 crew. The geometry was established. At 3:01 p.m., the first friction event arrived. The French frigate on the northern horizon had been monitoring the same contact picture. At 3:01 p.m., the French vessel's operations officer contacted the destroyer CIC on the NATO coordination circuit to request a situation assessment. Standard Allied protocol. The French commanding officer was watching the Udaloy's course change and requesting confirmation that the U.S. ship was managing it. The CIC watch officer handled the exchange. 45 seconds on a secure channel, confirming the contact picture, providing the CPA estimate, noting that the U.S. commanding officer had taken the con. The French frigate acknowledged and indicated they would maintain position and monitor. The number of nations watching this stretch of the Eastern Mediterranean at 3:02 p.m. had just increased by 1. CPA to Delta 1, 250 yards. Time to CPA 20 minutes. At 3:03 p.m., 2 airborne contacts appeared. Not from the northeast, where the Udaloy was approaching. From the east. From the Syrian coastline, 65 nautical miles away. Bridge CIC. 2 new airborne contacts bearing 078, range 65 nautical miles, altitude 200 feet, speed 580 knots. Classification consistent with Su-24 Fencer. On a direct approach heading. Time to intercept, approximately 6 minutes, 40 seconds. Su-24 Fencers. Launched from a Russian airbase on the Syrian coast. Approaching at 580 knots and 200 feet. the specific altitude and speed profile associated with the documented pattern of Russian Su-24 simulated attack runs against U.S. surface vessels in the Mediterranean. Multiple prior documented incidents, none producing behavioral modification. The two airborne contacts and the Udaloy had been coordinated. Surface contact approaching from the northeast, while two aircraft approached from the east, the standard Russian Mediterranean escalation geometry. Surface threat driving the bridge crew's attention to the horizon, while air contacts exploited the divided focus. The geometry had been designed for a bridge crew that would look up when the fencers came. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The captain stood at the center console. He had taken the con 10 minutes ago. He had not sat down since stepping onto the bridge. He had been reading the contact picture with the specific quality of attention that a carrier escort commanding officer applied to a situation that involved both his own ship and the asset he was assigned to protect, not the attention of someone managing a problem that affected only his vessel, but the attention of someone who understood that every decision he made in the next 14 minutes had a consequence that extended 40 nautical miles to the southwest. The carrier's flight operations were continuing. The carrier's battle group had not been placed at heightened readiness. The carrier's commanding officer did not yet know that a Udaloy-class destroyer was at 230 yards CPA from his escort, or the two Su-24s had just appeared from the Syrian coast at 580 knots. The escort's job was to resolve situations before they became the carrier's situations. The captain had 14 minutes. He had already made his central decision. He made it in the moment the fencer contacts appeared at 3:03 p.m., not after analysis, not after consultation, but immediately, because the geometry of the situation made the decision obvious to anyone who understood what the geometry was designed to produce. The geometry was designed to divide his attention. He was not going to divide his attention. The fencers would arrive in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The Udaloy would reach CPA in 19 minutes. If the destroyer's response posture oriented toward the air threat during those 6 minutes, the Udaloy had uncontested approach time. The geometry was designed to exploit the specific cognitive limitation of a bridge crew that could not maintain equal, simultaneous, uncompromised attention on both a closing surface warship and two low-altitude inbound aircraft at 580 knots. The captain was aware of this. He had been aware of it since the fencer contacts appeared. He was not going to give the geometry the intuitive response. CIC bridge. Fire control radar on Delta 1. Tracking mode, no illumination. He turned to the officer of the deck. Combat Air Patrol has the fencer picture. Confirm their tracking. The FA-18S on Combat Air Patrol above the battle group confirmed they were tracking both airborne contacts. The battle group's integrated air defense architecture was already processing the fencers. The carrier battle group had been designed for this layered threat environment. Air threats were the responsibility of the integrated air defense system. Surface threats were the destroyer's problem. The Udaloy was the destroyer's problem. The captain had just told his fire control radar that the CIWS on the destroyer's forward mount completed its power-on sequence and entered passive thermal tracking mode at 3:04 p.m. The barrel oriented toward the Udaloy. As the Udaloy moved, the barrel moved, not toward the fencers, toward the Udaloy. At 3:04 p.m., with two Su-24s 6 minutes away at 580 knots, the destroyer's close-in weapon system was tracking the surface contact. The barrel's orientation was visible from the Udaloy's bridge. CPA to Delta 1, 230 yards. Time to CPA 17 minutes. The Seahawk helicopter received authorization to launch at 3:05 p.m. Its roll, climb to 400 feet, establish a documentation orbit off the Udaloy's port beam. At 400 feet, it was above the fencer's 200-foot approach altitude. Its presence in the airspace, documented on radar, visible to the fencer pilots, added a variable their approach geometry had not included. The Seahawk launched at 3:06 p.m. and climbed to 400 feet. At 3:07 p.m., the first fencer pass occurred. The aircraft came in from the east at 200 feet and 575 knots, crossing the destroyer's bow at approximately 350 meters separation. The sound arrived before the aircraft was visually registered and departed before the visual impression was fully processed. The pressure wave. the sternum impact, the specific physical event of a combat aircraft at 200 feet that had characterized every prior documented encounter of this type. The second fencer crossed 400 meters astern, 25 seconds behind the first. The CIWS barrel tracking the Udaloy did not move toward the aircraft. The fire control radar on the Udaloy did not shift to the fencers. The Seahawk at 400 feet continued its orbit above the Udaloy's port beam. No one on the bridge spoke during the 4 seconds after the second fencer cleared the stern. Then the officer of the deck said, "Fire control radar still on Delta 1. CIWS tracking. Seahawk holding position. A status report." Also confirmation that the bridge crew's tactical priorities had not shifted during the aircraft pass. The Udaloy was still the primary surface contact. The Udaloy's bridge was still receiving fire control radar emissions from the destroyer. The CIWS barrel was still pointing at the Udaloy, while 2 Su-24s completed their pass and began their banking turn for another approach. CPA to Delta 1, 210 yards. Time to CPA, 14 minutes. At 3:09 p.m., the captain authorized a Channel 16 broadcast, brief, procedural, transmitted in English and Russian. The Udaloy was on a direct intercept course, presenting risk of collision, alter course to establish safe passing distance. The U.S. destroyer was maintaining its position. The Udaloy's Channel 16 response, translated after 35 seconds. The Russian warship is conducting authorized patrol operations. The American vessel should not be surprised to encounter Russian naval operations in international waters. We are conducting our operation as planned. As planned. Not a navigational argument. A statement that the approach was intentional and the plan had not changed. The phrasing went into the encounter record. It would appear in the intelligence assessment of Russian Mediterranean Fleet Doctrine. At 3:11 p.m., the second friction event, a priority message from the carrier's battle group commander, requesting a status update before any escalation beyond fire control radar activation. The battle group commander was monitoring and wanted confirmation of the tactical assessment before the encounter developed further. The political and strategic environment of the Eastern Mediterranean, the ongoing Syrian conflict, the Russian naval presence at Tartus, the NATO alliance obligations, the French frigate watching, required coordination at the battle group level for any escalation step. The captain provided the status: Delta 1 on intercept course, CPA 190 yards in 12 minutes, fire control radar in tracking mode, CIWS passive tracking, Seahawk deployed, Channel 16 exchange with no behavioral change from Delta 1, 2 fencers on raceway pattern. Assessment, coordinated misdirection maneuver, fencer passes designed to redirect tactical attention from surface contact. Current posture maintains surface contact as primary threat. The battle group commander's response: understood. Continue current posture. Coordinate with battle group air defense for fencer track management. Maintain fire control on Delta 1. Explicit authorization. The surface contact is primary. Confirmed at the battle group level. CPA to Delta 1, 175 yards. Time to CPA, 10 minutes. The Eastern Mediterranean, at 3:11 p.m., was the specific shade of deep blue that existed only in the Levantine Basin. Darker and more saturated than the Western Mediterranean, the watercolor that resulted from the depth and the particular mineral content of a nearly enclosed sea with its own circulation patterns. Through the bridge windows, the water was calm enough that the Udaloy's wake was visible at its current range, a white turbulence spreading behind the Russian destroyer's hull in a V-shape that was, at this distance, the most specific and personal indicator of the closing geometry. A wake that spread and spread as a ship held its course toward your position. The French frigate was a gray shape at the northern horizon, 14 nautical miles away, watching with radar what it could not see with optics. The carrier to the southwest was invisible from the bridge. 40 nautical miles was well beyond visual range, but its presence was the operational fact that everything else in the picture was organized around. The second fencer pass occurred at 3:12 p.m. The aircraft came in at 250 feet, slightly higher than the first pass, crossing at wider separation, 400 meters rather than 350. Less operationally threatening. The CIWS barrel did not move from the Udaloy's bearing during the approach, crossing or departure. The Udaloy's bridge crew was receiving fire control radar emissions throughout the second pass. During the 3 seconds, the fencers were at their closest point. A U.S. warship's fire control radar was tracking the Udaloy. The CIWS was pointed at the Udaloy, and the Su-24s had just completed a second pass that had changed none of that. At 3:13 p.m., the TEL appeared. The Udaloy reduced speed from 18 knots to 16, a 2-knot reduction. The CPA projection, which had been holding at 175 yards and dropping with each radar sweep, stabilized. Then it began to open, 177 yards, then 180, as the Udaloy's slowed speed changed the timing of its arrival at the CPA position. The CIC tactical officer reported it after 3 sweep cycles of confirmation. Delta 1 reducing speed, now tracking at 16 knots. CPA projection stabilizing and beginning to open, projecting 185 yards and climbing. The captain had noted the speed reduction 11 seconds before the report. He said nothing. He was watching the Udaloy's track on the radar display, watching the CPA counter begin its reversal. A 2-knot reduction was not a course change. It was not a withdrawal. It was the Udaloy's commanding officer making a judgment, without Channel 16 communication, without any acknowledged concession, that the specific geometry he had come to establish was no longer achievable against a target that had fire control radar tracking him and a CIWS barrel pointed at him while his Su-24s were completing their second pass with no visible effect on the U.S. destroyer's tactical posture. The misdirection had failed. The Udaloy knew it. CPA to Delta 1, 190 yards. Time to CPA, 9 minutes. CPA continuing to open. At 3:16 p.m., the Udaloy adjusted course, 3 degrees to the west, away from the intercept vector it had held since 2:58 p.m. The tactical officer reported it. Delta 1 altering course, 3 degrees to west. CPA now projecting 240 yards and continuing to open. 240 yards, then 270, then 310. The Udaloy was clearing. At 3:17 p.m., the third fencer pass did not occur. The 2 aircraft, banking for their third approach, altered track northeast, toward the Syrian coast toward their base. The raceway had ended. CPA to Delta 1, 380 yards and opening. No Channel 16 transmission accompanied the course change. The Udaloy had stated at 3:09 p.m. that the operation was proceeding as planned. The course change was also as planned, a withdrawal that was prepared and executable without any formal acknowledgement that the approach had not achieved its objective. The fire control radar remained in tracking mode on the Udaloy until it had opened to 800 yards. Then standby mode. CIWS to passive surveillance. Seahawk documentation orbit for an additional 6 minutes, then recovery. On the bridge, no one spoke for a long moment. The helmsman had held course 270 through 2 Su-24 passes at 200 feet. A Russian warship at 175 yard projected CPA before the course change, fire control radar activation, CIWS tracking, and a battle group commander's priority message. Course 270. He had held it. The Udaloy was at 820 yards, and the course had not moved. The officer of the deck looked at the contact picture. Delta 1 at 850 yards, continuing to open. The fencer contacts had dropped off the picture. The French frigate on the northern horizon, the commercial traffic to the south, the carrier's battle group distributed across the southwestern sector. The picture returning to normal. He straightened his collar. It had not needed straightening. In the CIC, the electronic warfare operator was completing the encounter log entry for the fire control radar activation, noting the time of activation, the tracking mode designation, the duration, and the Udaloy's observable response to each of the activation's major developments. 16 minutes of fire control radar and tracking mode on a Russian Udaloy-class destroyer in the eastern Mediterranean, while 2 Su-24s made their passes. The log entry would join the encounter package going to the Battle Group Commander, 7th Fleet, and the NATO Maritime Command. It would eventually appear in a broader intelligence assessment of Russian Mediterranean Fleet Coordination Doctrine. It would appear there as a data point. Data points accumulated into patterns. Patterns informed the next crew that encountered this geometry about what to expect and what had worked before. The CIC operator finishing his log entry at 3:28 p.m. was doing something that mattered beyond 3:28 p.m. and beyond this stretch of the eastern Mediterranean. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to the carrier's battle group commander, to 7th Fleet, and to the NATO Maritime Command in Naples. It would include the fencer track data, the Udaloy's approach and withdrawal geometry, the fire control radar activation log, the Channel 16. Exchange with the as-planned response and the battle group commander's explicit authorization to maintain the fire control tracking posture. Secure fire control radar. CIWS passive. Seahawk recovery on the OOD's call. He looked at the contact picture. The Udaloy was at 910 yards. Resume standard escort station. Notify the carrier. Situation resolved. Delta 1 withdrawing. Fencers have cleared the picture. No weapons employed. He turned toward the sea cabin. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. One Russian Udaloy-class destroyer departed Tartus naval facility and established a direct intercept course toward a U.S. destroyer on carrier escort station 12 nautical miles from a U.S. aircraft carrier at 2:58 p.m. in the eastern Mediterranean. Two Su-24 Fencer aircraft launched from a Russian airbase on the Syrian coast and conducted approach passes simultaneously with the Udaloy's surface approach. Udaloy approach speed, 18 knots. CPA projected at time of fire control radar activation, 175 yards, 10 minutes. Minimum projected CPA before course change, 175 yards. Su-24 Fencer passes conducted, 2 completed, 1 aborted. Minimum altitude recorded, 200 feet. U.S. destroyer tactical priority during both passes, surface contact Delta 1 maintained as primary. Fire control radar and CIWS remained oriented on Udaloy throughout both passes. Channel 16. Exchange with Udaloy. 1. Russian response. Operation proceeding as planned. U.S. destroyer responses to fencer passes, 0. Course or speed changes in response to fencer passes, 0. Battle Group Commander authorization for fire control tracking posture. Yes, received 3:13 p.m. French frigate NATO coordination maintained throughout. Yes. Udaloy speed reduction tell, 3:13 p.m. 2 knots. Udaloy course change, 3:16 p.m. 3 degrees west. Fencers aborted third pass and returned to base, 3:17 p.m. Course alterations by U.S. destroyer, 0. Speed changes under combined surface and air pressure, 0. Carrier escort station maintained throughout. Yes. Carrier operations uninterrupted. Yes. The eastern Mediterranean at 3:16 p.m. held a carrier 40 miles southwest and a Russian destroyer opening at 3 degrees west. The misdirection had been designed for a bridge crew that would look up when the fencers came. This crew looked at the Udaloy. The CIWS looked at the Udaloy. The fire control radar looked at the Udaloy. The fencers passed twice and changed nothing. The carrier continued its flight operations. The 12 nautical miles held.